Hello everyone, today I am recording live from an ancient Egyptian party. Don't they look like they're having a good time over there? I'm sure they are. Not sure what they're all happy about, but that's what they do in ancient Egypt, right? But today we're talking about Egyptologist Dr. David Falk and some troubling things he has said about Hebrew translations. A number of scholars and I have noticed several times where he'll be asked about a English translation of the Bible, and he'll throw out some facts about Hebrew and why you should take his certain translation. The problem is that he seems to misremember or misapply Hebrew rules quite often, and then he'll do it super confidently, which gives listeners the false idea that he must be right because he's just so confident about it. This worries me because I don't want to be misinformed. It also hurts my ability to trust him in other things he says. So, if he's super confident here and yet very wrong, why would I trust him in other areas where he is confident? Dr. Falk has helped out a lot of people and helped them understand things about the Bible, ancient Egypt, but repeated mistakes like this really hurt his ability to help people. I make this video with the desire to correct some misinformation and encourage Dr. Falk to be more careful in the future. With that being said, let's get into this. The first one is where Dr. Falk is trying to argue for the traditional translation of Genesis 1:1 in the beginning. You can check out my full response in the description where I point out more errors, but I'm going to show you that not only does Falk misunderstand the Hebrew for this verse on a sadly basic level, but he cites a scholar for evidence of a rule, but that scholar doesn't even agree with the rule to begin with.
Now, there have been two major proposed grammatical structures for Genesis 1:1. The traditional rendering is that Genesis 1:1 is a complete, independent clause that begins with a prepositional phrase, so that it reads, quote, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." But recently, a different grammatical structure for Genesis 1:1 has been proposed, which has been gaining popularity. That proposal is that Genesis 1:1 is part of an introductory subordinate clause, so that the text reads, quote, "When God began to create the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God moved over the surface of the waters, God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light." I have some concerns with that latter reading that have given me pause to accept it. The first is the grammar itself. Hebrew is a language that tends to deprecate extensive use of subordinate clauses. Moreover, there are introductory subordinate clauses in Hebrew, but they are rare at best. There are two known constructs for introductory subordinate clauses, which involve the use of the subordinate adverb ki and the conjunction va. Neither is used in this case. Moreover, when they are used, there is typically a change in syntax for both of these cases, where the subject-verb-object order is used instead of the verb-subject-object to indicate subordination. Genesis 1:1 uses verb-subject-object syntax that's more typical of independent clauses. So my first concern is that this proposal is using a grammatical construction without strong precedent in ancient Hebrew.
He says Hebrew is a language that tends to deprecate extensive use of subordinate clauses. Moreover, there are introductory subordinate clauses in Hebrew, but they are rare at best. I myself agree, although I would say the word rare is a little unclear, so I'm not sure what he means. He says there are two known constructs for introductory subordinate clauses, which involve the use of the subordinate adverb ki and the conjunction vav. Neither is used in this case. Moreover, when they are used, there is typically a change in syntax for both of these cases, where the subject-verb-object order is used instead of the verb-subject-object to indicate subordination. In other words, there are two ways that someone would do a translation like when God began to create in ancient Hebrew, and the two ways it does this aren't in Genesis 1:1-3. He says Genesis 1:1 uses verb-subject-object syntax that's more typical of independent clauses. So my first concern is that this proposal is using a grammatical construction without strong precedent in ancient Hebrew. Later in the comments, Dr. Falk notes where he got the idea that there were two ways of writing introductory subordinate clauses. He says Boa Saxon wrote a peer review article in 2013 entirely on subordination in biblical Hebrew. He cites only two examples of introductory subordination, which have very specific rules as opposed to concatenated subordination, where the rules are more relaxed. End quote. Considering I've read quite possibly all of the relevant literature on this topic, I was surprised to have never heard this argument before. I've read all kinds of other similar verses which have extremely similar formats as Genesis 1:1-3, so I've always thought that this interpretation has strong precedent in Hebrew. Surely, for Dr. Falk to mention this made me think I must have missed something. Therefore, I was very interested to see what Dr. Saxon has to say. After reading the article twice, I came away confused, as it appeared to be an article just listing various ways that sentences are subordinated in Hebrew, rather than an exhaustive list. This is important because for Dr. Falk's argument to hold any relevance to the discussion, there would need to be only two ways that Hebrew introductory sentences are subordinated. If there are a bunch of other ways that introductory sentences can be subordinated, but Dr. Saxon just didn't mention them, then the Hebrew writer of Genesis 1 could have easily just used one of those other ways instead. Therefore, I asked Dr. Saxon directly. I said, do you think your recent research on subordination helps settle the debate at all? He says, your question about the possible subordinate status of Genesis 1:1 as temporal clause cannot be settled definitely by my research on subordination in classical Hebrew. Further confused, I asked, are you saying that your analysis wasn't exhaustive of all the different ways Hebrew writers used introductory subordination? He says, for an exhaustive treatment, I must refer to my forthcoming book. So whatever Dr. Falk thought Dr. Saxon's work showed, Dr. Saxon himself doesn't even agree. Rather, there are lots of times when an introductory subordinate clause is used in other verses, like Genesis 1:1-3, in the when God began to create translation. We only have to flip one page over in our Bibles to read Genesis 2:4b-7, having an almost identical structure where there is an introductory relative clause, followed by circumstantial clauses, followed by a main clause. Dr. Falk is right to point out that the sentence structure verb, subject, object is typical of independent clauses, but there is a long list of times where the structure is used of relative clauses, so I don't see that as very helpful in this discussion. One last thing before we go to the next one. While I do have some knowledge in Hebrew, each example I give from here on out is going to include a response from one or more conservative scholars and at least one critical scholar, so it's not like you just have to trust me. Before we talk about our second example of poor translation analysis, let's talk about the context of Judges 11:26. In this passage, the Ammonites are attacking Gilead, an ancient city, which Jephthah was in charge of. Jephthah responds by saying, "Why have you come to attack me?" The Ammonites respond with, "Because you took our land." Jephthah was like, "No, we didn't. God gave the land to us that was previously owned by the Amorites." So that's when in verse 22 it says the Israelites took all the land of the Israelites back in the day. Then in verse 23 says, since the Lord God of Israel has driven out the Amorites before his people Israel, do you think you can just take it from them? You have the right to take what Chemosh, your God, gives you, but we will take the land of all whom the Lord our God has driven out before us. Are you really better than Balak son of Zippor, king of Moab? Did he dare to quarrel with Israel? Did he dare to fight with them? So he's like, God gave Israel the land. Do you think you can just take it? If your God gives you something, doesn't it belong to you? Are you better than this other guy who didn't dare fight us? Then we get to the verse in question. Pretty much every translation out there reads something like, Israel has been living in Heshbon and its nearby towns, in Arur and its nearby towns, and in all the cities along the Arnon for 300 years. Why did you not reclaim them during that time? In other words, we've been here for 300 years and now you're finally trying to take back what you think we took from you supposedly 300 years ago? Okay, so this translation makes a lot of sense with the context, but Dr. Falk wants to challenge this translation. The next one we will look at here has Dr. Falk challenging the translation of Judges 11:26 in response to Scott Stripling on the dating of the Exodus. Dr. Falk confidently gives what he thinks is the best translation, but oddly gives no evidence for it. See, this is a recurrent problem I've noticed with Falk because there have been several times where he will confidently say something. It is definitely this, but then give no evidence for it. And then someone asks him about it a week later, and his reasoning is kind of weak.
Now, the second passage I want to look at briefly is Judges 11:26. For 300 years, Israel occupied Heshbon, Aroer, and the surrounding settlements and all the towns along the Arnon. Why didn't you retake them during this time? Of course, you have a land dispute between Jephthah and the Ammonites. Well, we would all date Jephthah to around 1100. There's a 300-year period mentioned. 1100 plus 300 is 1400. And for those who were taking an early date for the Exodus, this would put them very comfortably of where they think how they think the math should work right at the transition between these two centuries.
Stripling is making a case here that the 300 years that Jephthah cites in Judges 11:26 is evidence for an 18th dynasty exodus. And while we have talked frequently about the historical errors in Jephthah's letter to the king of the Ammonites, I noticed something about this text that I hadn't seen before, something really interesting. English translations render Judges 11:26, while Israel lived in Heshbon and its villages. However, this is a bait clause. That's a problem. English translations often translate this as an adverbial temporal subordinate clause. However, the original Hebrew is a prepositional clause. What's the difference? English adverbial temporal subordinate clauses connote a span of time. Hebrew prepositional clauses connote a circumstance. Now, it can be temporal sometimes, but it doesn't have to be. So then a better translation of this would be, with Israel living in Heshbon and its villages, and in Arer and its villages, and in all the cities that are on the banks of the Arnon, 300 years? And why didn't you recover them in that time? This has a different nuance than the normal English rendering, which is that the 300 years is not necessarily connected to the initial Israelite conquest, but to the Amorite conquest alluded to in Judges 11:22. Therefore, the text implies that the Ammonites couldn't take back the land not only from the Amorites, but also from the Israelites who were weaker. Therefore, the Ammonite god was too weak to take the land back.
Now, if you pay attention real closely, you'll notice that Dr. David Falk never actually gives evidence for his position. Falk says,
English translations render Judges 11:26, while Israel lived in Heshbon and its villages. However, this is a bait clause. That's a problem.
So in just a couple sentences, no evidence so far. He just reads the common translation. Point out it's a bait clause, which he says this because the clause starts with the Hebrew letter bait and then says it's a problem. But the question, of course, is why is it a problem? He says,
English translations often translate this as an adverbial temporal subordinate clause. However, the original Hebrew is a prepositional clause. What's the difference? English adverbial temporal subordinate clauses connote a span of time. Hebrew prepositional clauses connote a circumstance. Now, it can be temporal sometimes, but it doesn't have to be. So then a better translation of this would be, with Israel living in Heshbon and its villages, and in Arar and its villages, and in all the cities that are on the banks of the Arnon, 300 years? And why didn't you recover them in that time?
and then he goes on to his preferred translation and what he thinks the implications are. He says the translation that Sterpling uses, which just happens to be the most popular translation, and I was unable to find anybody who holds any different views. He says that translation is incorrect. He gives his better translation, but he doesn't give any evidence of it. He didn't give any reason to justify his translation as better. He didn't even give evidence it was even possible. Not even the most likely, but that it was possible to begin with. He just says it. There was no verses given, no citations from other scholars, not even an argument. As we will see, not only does he seem to not understand Hebrew concepts here, he for some reason thinks it's better to go against all of the popular translations, but yet doesn't give any evidence for it. The following is a conversation between Dr. Joel Koretko and Dr. Kip Davis. While they are both not linguists in the formal sense, both of their dissertations required extensive knowledge in Hebrew, so it's worth listening to their opinion here. Dr. Joel Koretko says, it's an infinitive construct with a prefix bait. That's obviously temporal. In this context, designating a span of time as bait does. Kip says calling it a prepositional clause is idiotic nonsense. A prepositional clause is basically any verbal or nominal clause that is syntactically predicated on the function of the preposition. In this case, I think he means to translate this as a circumstantial clause, but the appearance of bait doesn't help him to get there. Kip then confirms what Joel says and says, yes, as bait does, like all the time. Joel says, yes, especially when the context makes it obvious, and the context is a large span of time. Kip responds, it's not even so much that his Hebrew is terrible, it's that he promotes his incompetence with such pompous bravado. Kip then says, why even propose a novel translation, departing from every English translation when you have no idea what you're doing in the first place? Dr. Koretko chimes in with a voice memo.
So basically, is he saying then that, like, the circumstantial clause, it's like, with such and such happening, M dash, why did such and such and such and such happen? Rather than when such and such and such was happening, why did... I think that's what he's getting at, and so yeah, he's inserting, what is that, anakaluthon, is that the term? When you like get an M dash in there? Yeah, that's totally unwarranted from the Hebrew syntax, and you need to make a serious case why there's a disjunction in the Hebrew to create that kind of clause, if I'm understanding him correctly, which I think is what you're saying.
Kip says, this is his translation. With Israel living in Heshbon and its villages, and in Ar and its villages, and in all the cities that are on the banks of the Arnon. 300 years? Question mark. And why didn't you recover them in that time? It feels like he wants to set off the bait clauses as a parenthetical statement, but I can't make any sense of it. It's clunky and nonsensical as HE double hockey sticks. Dr. Koretko chimes in again.
I don't have the Hebrew in front of me, but isn't it an adverbial accusative of time for the 300 years? Like, doesn't that have to connect to the verbal element from, I think it's Yeshav in the infinitive construct? Like, how is he getting an M dash here?
Kip responds with his own voice memo.
Yes, absolutely correct. Like, it's so obvious. You have to perform. It's a gymnastic of nonsense.
And then he says, the way he vocalizes his translation makes it sound like he thinks 300 years is unconnected to the infinitive construct, rather part of the question introduced by WYPDTY. That's idiotic. Now, if that didn't make sense, let me dumb it down for you. When we are thinking about translations in this instance, we are thinking if someone wants to communicate something, how would we expect them to do it? When people communicate in literature or just in everyday life, it is extremely rare for someone to purposely be vague and confusing and say things that make you think they think things that they don't actually mean. In this instance, it is an infinitive word with a Hebrew letter bait at the front. This bait can mean a lot of things depending on the rest of the sentence. What contextual clues could give us the idea of what this bait is being used as? Well, when you look at the sentence mentions that there is 300 years. That's a really strong indication that this bait is being used temporally to indicate time, which is why most mainline translations go with this. Additionally, the bait is on an infinitive. Like an infinitive is like to eat, to drink, to grow. And so this Hebrew letter bait is on the infinitive word. And in these instances, that's also very common to be used temporally as seen in this biblical Hebrew grammar. Also, from the context in itself, Jephthah is asked to be the leader of Gilead and gives them a serious rebuke. When we get to the verse, it mentions Israel living in the land. It says 300 years. Then it says, why did you not reclaim them during this time? When we look at the actual verse, it says something about Israel living in the land. Then it says 300 years. Then it says, why did you not reclaim them during that time? When we look at Falk's translation, it's awkward. Like, what sense does it make for the 300 years to refer to words from 4 verses previously when it fits extremely well with the words used right next to it? What contextual reason is there to think there is a break in the sentence as some type of parenthetical? If I am attempting to communicate things to people and I'm a good writer, am I going to speak in a way that's very easily confusing? Or am I going to vaguely refer to time periods that were mentioned 4 verses ago and give no indication of it? Or am I going to use a number to refer to the details right next to it? Which one makes more sense? If I was going to attempt to convey a random break in the sentence that doesn't refer to what was just said, but actually refers to something 4 verses previously, why would I give no indication of it if that's what I'm trying to communicate? Well, I'm obviously not going to do that, right? More can be said against this translation due to it not really fitting the context, but we'll move on. The next one we have is Falk's comments on Psalm 22:16, where he argues for a specific translation, but misses a ton of really key important information.
Difference between like a lion, which is ki ori, or kori, which is pierced, it's a difference of 1 letter. And that 1 letter is an aleph. In the Masoretic text, it is ki ori with the aleph. So it is like a lion. But if you look at the Septuagint, it says pierced. But we also had a Dead Sea Scroll, which is 4Q Psalm F, which has the Kaf Resh, there's no aleph there. So that's pierced. When you look at, say, the Syriac Peshta, the Septuagint, say the translations, the ancient translations, it does seem to be leaning more towards along the lines of pierced. I think the superior reading here is probably pierced.
Even the NET translation footnotes, which is actually very conservative, says, the Masoretic text reads, like a lion, my hands and my feet. The reading is difficult and the ancient versions vary, so the textual difficulty is probably very early. Without a verb, the syntax appears broken and the role of hands and feet is unclear. One option is to understand the verb of the previous line to apply again, a poetic technique called ellipsis and double duty. But my hands and my feet would be an odd object for a verb, meaning they encircled. Otherwise, the broken syntax may represent the emotional outcry of the psalmist, first mentioning the lion as part of the third-person description, but suddenly shifting to the first-person perspective and crying out as the lion attacks, pinning down his hands and feet. Parentheses, a scene depicted in ancient Near Eastern art. But this development seems late, textually. All the other witnesses have a verb instead of like a lion. The Septuagint says, they dug my hands and feet. The verb uruso means to burrow in the ground, to dig. A Qumran witness seems to read similarly, they dug, instead of the Masoretic text, kiari, like a lion. The scroll from Nahal Hever has a verb form, ka'aru, ending with vav instead of yod. Supposing that the aleph is a superfluous spelling variant, the form would be understood as karu, from the root kara, meaning they dug. In that case, the Qumran scroll and the Septuagint agree, because kara is one of the two verbs translated in the Septuagint by oruso. But as both these verbs mean to dig, as in the dirt, this has not helped us understand the context. Assuming that the enemies are still the subject, we might expect they dug a pit for my hands and feet. In fact, the Hebrew words behind they dug a pit look similar. So it's not hard to imagine that one of these two would be overlooked by a scribe and dropped from the text. Some suppose that to dig, as in to dig in the ground, means to pierce, in reference to hands and feet. Some suppose that to dig in the ground means to pierce, in reference to hands and feet. Other variants and suggestions include they browned, or they picked clean. My hands and my feet, or my hands and feet are consumed, or worn out. The latter two assume a copying error, or resh for lamed, making the verb come from kala, I can't see the words on it, whatever. P. Craigie opts for this last, but also cites Syriac and Akkadian for additional root krh, meaning to be shrunken, shriveled. The Akkadian verb karu is said of body parts and can refer to paralysis, which is the kind of metaphor which occurs in battle contexts elsewhere, like Psalm 76:5. It would be very natural to read my hands and my feet as the subject of the verb because verb subject is a typical word order. There is no decisive answer to the problem, and the NET translation includes the lion imagery of verse 13 and supposes a verb that conveys an attack. So, if anything, the NET translators clearly were not nearly as confident as Dr. Falk. Dr. Daniel McClellan also gives his analysis of this, and he shows that Dr. Falk leaves out even more key information.
Its own. And the word like a lion is kaf, aleph, resh, yod. And if we go look in a Dead Sea Scrolls manuscript, we have kaf, aleph, resh, vav. And that also doesn't really mean anything unless you take the aleph out and you have kaf, resh, vav. That would mean they dug out my hands and my feet, not they pierced. Because there's a word for they pierced. If the idea is that somebody drove nails through somebody's hands and feet, they have a perfectly good word for that. This is not that word. This means dug out. The idea here is you're removing material, and the semantic focus is on the space or the surface that remains after that material has been removed. This is not somebody driving nails through somebody's hands or feet. Now, the early Christians, who are the first to reread it as they pierced my hands and my feet, are relying on the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation, which seems to have understood it according to this reconstruction where it is this verb, kaf, resh, he, in the plural, so it's kaf, resh, vav, and they use a verb in the Greek that means to dig out. Again, they have a perfectly good word that means to pierce. If they had in mind the act of driving nails through somebody's hands and feet, they would have used a different verb, but they use this verb that means to dig out, which also focuses on the removal of material and then the space or the surface that remains. Now, what apologists will do, and what early Christians did, was they squinted at that until it got really fuzzy. And then the blurry edges overlapped with the blurry edges of the notion of crucifixion. They could be like, I can see how dig out could be kind of fuzzily understood to refer to piercing somebody's hands and feet with nails. And that is dogmatic and presuppositional. That's not a valid reading of the text. That is approaching the text uncritically and thinking, I want to find what I'm bringing to the text, and I can convince myself that that's not impossible. So I'm happy with that misinterpretation. But it does not mean that. So when you say it says they pierced my hands and my feet, you're saying I'm endorsing a specific reconstruction of this text and then a misinterpretation of that reconstruction. Because most scholars will say, let's try to find a resolution that doesn't alter the text. And that's not easy, but that's not impossible. You could imagine that because this is the third of 3 clauses in this verse, and the first 2 clauses have to do with enemies surrounding the psalmist. Maybe the third clause does as well, and the lack of verbs only means that they are relying on the verb from the previous clause and just elided it in the third clause. So it might mean, like a lion, they encircle my hands and my feet. That's a plausible resolution. Others will say, well, we can reconstruct some other kind of Hebrew, so maybe it is kaf, resh, vav. And maybe it was they dug a pit, in which case what follows would be beit, vav, resh. And maybe a scribe thought that was a repetition of the same word, or maybe a scribe made an error in transcribing 2 words that look very similar and accidentally omitted one. So maybe that's what's going on. That's also a plausible resolution. But to reconstruct it according to what the Septuagint translator may have had in their source text, and then misinterpret that to arrive at they pierced my hands and my feet, is the least likely of all of the resolutions that have been offered by critical scholars. And there have been a lot of them. So Psalm 22:16 does not say, they pierced my hands and my feet.
This is a big problem because people see Falk as an authority figure. Not only does he miss information that would bolster his view, but he also leaves out a lot of evidence against his view. At least if he included opposing views and then told us why his is the best, then we can make the decision for ourselves. Otherwise, we're either just stuck without information, or we just pretty much blindly trust him. After just watching Falk's 1-minute video, many people will go off and think this verse is great evidence for prophecy, share it with their friends, make this a big reason for why they accept Christianity, and then later realize that Falk was missing a lot of key info. What's going to happen when they come across someone like Daniel McClellan and think they've been deceived? This whole predicament will cause people a lot of sadness, anxiety, and maybe even make them leave Christianity. The last instance we will look at is where Dr. Falk is responding to the recent supposed words of Moses as claimed by Patterns of Evidence. Falk is right that this doesn't say anything about Moses, but one of his reasons includes an error in understanding Hebrew.
Baran says that he spotted a very specific set of symbols, what he translates as ZTMMS. Now, that might sound like just a bunch of random letters, but in ancient Semitic languages, that would actually be read as Zot Im Moshi, which means this is from Moses.
Now, Zot is the demonstrative pronoun, this, okay? So this is supposed to read, this is from Moses.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the problem is it's in the predicate position. So this is a predicate. Now, by Baran's admission, this was a text that was put in after the fact. So this is from Moses. Now, when you have a disconnected, so you don't have an antecedent for the this, okay? The demonstrative pronoun is supposed to agree in gender and number with the closest related object.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is zot is in the feminine singular.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So what this should read is za and Moshe, because the closest related object, because there is no antecedent, because this is from another author later on, should be in the masculine.
Mm-hmm.
So the closest object to give that demonstrative pronoun gender is Moses.
Dr. Falk says the demonstrative pronoun is supposed to agree in gender and number with the closest object. Dr. Joel Koretko and Dr. Kip Davis had something also to say about this. Kip says, LOL, what a buffoon. Joel says, in response to Dr. Falk, he says, with its referent, David. For clarity, I asked, so he's wrong about the wording, but right about the basic concept. Joel says, no, the closest object is not always going to be the referent of the demonstrative and demonstratives. And demonstratives can do other things. Kip says, yes, demonstratives must agree in gender and number with their antecedents, but that is not what he's saying. That's not what Dr. Falk is saying. He seems to be saying that because zot is in close proximity to mish, or I don't know how you want to pronounce that the agreement must be with this word, which, as Joel points out, is catastrophically wrong. But this is not just a feature of Hebrew. This is just a basic language thing. In any language that I know, demonstratives need to find agreement with their antecedents. It's basic. So yeah, that's that. That's 4 instances where Falk confidently gets basic things wrong, or doesn't mention key information, or just misunderstands what other scholars are saying about Hebrew concepts. It should be said that I'm not trying to make Dr. Falk look bad out of spite or something. I genuinely would love to see Dr. Falk be great at his Hebrew. I'd love to see him give evidence for his views and convince me himself, prove me wrong. And if someone corrects me, I'll cut it out of the video or take the video down to make sure nobody is misinformed. But anyways, go subscribe to his channel. He's got the best conservative content on the Exodus from Egypt, even if some things he says is off about the Hebrew. If you want more people to hear about this, leave a comment on this video so the YouTube algorithm will show it to more people. Anyways, thanks for watching. It's been fun, and hope you guys have a good one.